Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast. Now for today's episode, we're doing things a little differently because instead of a normal race review, we're going to give you a behind the scenes look of how a Grand Prix progresses. Coming to you from within the Silverstone paddock, I'll be speaking to three great F1 journalists, each after free practice, quali, and then the race itself. So first up, we've got the Mirror's F1 correspondent Daniel Moxon to help me run through all the things McLaren did in free practice. So Dan from the Mirror's joining me. We're going to do it a little bit different for the British Grand Prix. As we're in the paddock, we're going to do sort of a session review, preview of quali. So we're speaking to you right now in a gap between FP3 and quali. Dan, overall thoughts on the event so far? Let's start as a general event, rather we'll get into McLaren in a minute, but I mean, it's very wet and grey.
Yes, just about. I think everyone's had a swim to the paddock this morning rather than a walk, and it's not very July. It's cold, it's wet, it's grey, a little bit miserable. But I suppose that's the charm of the British weather, isn't it? We just, keep calm and carry on and all that. But
Yes, it's a very typical British summer's day, and by that I mean cold and wet. But on track action, been quite good for McLaren so far. I mean, obviously it's only practice, so we can't read too much into it. But Lando topping both FP1 and FP2, and then P3 and P7 for the team in FP3. Oscar P3 in FP1, P2 in FP2, and then, like I said, P7 in FP3. Good start so far. Good start. Should there be a lot of hope going into quali, I'd imagine, from that, or are you trying not to read too much into free practice?
Well, you always do have to kind of take practice with a pinch of salt in any practice session. These ones especially because, I mean, we had a wet track, a drying track, then a bit more rain, and, when the changeable conditions like that during a session, it's always a little bit, how much of this can we actually read into? But it's never a bad thing to be that far up the timesheets at all, particularly yesterday. I think they'll be very pleased, as you say, both drivers were in the top three in FP1 and FP2, so that's very, very encouraging. But we had a chat with Zach Brown this morning, and he predicted that between now and the end of the season, 4 teams are probably going to win races, so you can see the mentality there from McLaren's side. They clearly think they're in a 4-way fight at pretty much every Grand Prix they're going into now.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Who would have thought that going into this year? I think everyone was thinking Red Bull going to win by a mile, and like you said, they've got McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes, maybe Ferrari. I think they're not looking too great this weekend, but yeah, it's exciting to have a lot of teams involved. You mentioned Zach Brown. He's probably quite a good person to speak to. He's been making some headlines of his own heading into the weekend. Not best pleased with Red Bull, I think is the way to describe it. I've got some of his quotes. I mean, he was basically, to sum up, having a go at their professionalism, maybe their attitude after the Austria incident. I think the Austria incident has been something that everyone's talked about. I think every driver's been asked their opinion. And while the drivers, in particular Lando, has backtracked quite a lot or rode back on what he said in the heat of the moment, Zach Brown was not keen to do such thing. I mean, he spoke in the press conference yesterday. He had another press conference today on Saturday morning. What's your take on Zach's overall attack on Red Bull? I think that's not unfair to say.
Yes, quite the contrast between Zach and Lando's approach to this. Whether it was Lando's own decision or maybe whether the McLaren comp team got his ear a bit and say, we don't need to persist with this. We can just sort of, play it down in public. If that is the case, Zach very much did not get the memo, did he? So, quite an attack is definitely the right way to do it. It was pretty full frontal, no holding back on anything. Clearly of the opinion that Red Bull have sort of fostered this culture that gives Max Verstappen what, in Zach's words, the right to basically drive how he wants on track. Some of it I thought was fair, some of it maybe a little over the top. I find it interesting that this incident was the one that has sparked this because, I mean, obviously it had huge consequences, that crash or that collision in Austria. The actual touch itself was obviously a very light touch. I think more of the ire was more around the way that Max was defending in the laps leading up to it rather than the actual incident itself. So, it's an interesting way that Zach's gone on this one, but I mean, he's never been afraid to criticise Red Bull in the past. He and Christian Horner are very much not on each other's Christmas card lists. I imagine that will be even further from the case now after this latest one, but Zach, not a Red Bull fan.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair enough. And I mean, it's hard to know when Zach started feeling like this, but I think it would probably, in my best guess, would date back to the cost cap stuff, because I think of all the team principals, all the CEOs in Zach's case, he was the most vocal, wasn't he? He was really annoyed about Red Bull. He wrote a letter to the FIA. I don't know if it was meant to get out, but it did get out, and obviously Red Bull and Horner in particular weren't best pleased about what Zach Brown had to say. And I think, yeah, you're right to point on that relationship, because obviously Max and Lando are great friends. They often travel back, so that probably explains why they were quite a bit more chummy in the last few days. I mean, Lando and Max said they both spoke on Monday, and I think they spoke on Wednesday as well. And sort of air very much cleared between those two, but Zach Brown and Christian Horner, I mean, to be fair, we've yet to hear Horner's sort of rebuttal, as it were, of what Zach said. But yeah, interesting point that Zach in particular said he would have no interest in speaking to Horner about this. So that would very much imply he's not looking for any kind of salvation, wouldn't it? Like, he's not looking to make friends and move on.
No, I don't think he's particularly interested in being all chummy with Christian. And as you say, we haven't heard from Christian yet. He's been keeping quite a low profile for most of the season, for obvious reasons. He tends to do his session with print media after the race on a Sunday, so that's when we'll hear from him. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about this. So that will be interesting to see how he replies to all this. But yeah, Zach, I mean, you mentioned the cost cap. There was the whole thing about the A team and B teams as well, which Zach was and still is sort of leading a bit of a one-man crusade on that front. He hasn't had a great deal of public support on that one yet. But yeah, like we say, Zach and Christian are never going to be the best of friends. It doesn't seem like they're going to be friends at all. But yeah, interesting to see how willing Zach is to be public about all this. I think that is the surprising thing for me. You know, there's always tensions behind the scenes, but you know, the cloak and dagger approach is not the one that Zach's going with on this one. So we'll interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, you're right, because I mean, this obviously naturally leads on from what Andrea Stella had to say, but that was very much the heat of the moment. He stepped off the pit wall and he was speaking into a microphone straight away. Whereas Zach Brown, he's obviously been thinking about this for a few days, and he's obviously been thinking about what I'm going to say. I mean, like we said, he had a media session today, Saturday morning, which was quite unusual. If a team principal has spoken in a press conference, they don't tend to do an extra media session, and that media session was largely dominated by this subject. I mean, some of the stuff he was saying, I mean, he was particularly annoyed about the way that Red Bull sort of treated Max after the race. They were suggesting that it wasn't his fault, it was maybe Lando's fault, and I think that in particular was what really pushed him over the edge, because he's, like you said, he's had a few instances now where he's been a little bit annoyed by Red Bull, but this time, for whatever reason, that little radio message at the end of the race, and I think it was Horner who said it has made Zach Brown sort of click, and he's sort of gone really angry. I mean, it was very much a big surprise, and I think, yeah, like we'll see what happens with these two. Obviously, I think another revealing thing that Zach Brown said was that the team principal meetings, I think it was quite embarrassing, was how he used to describe it. I mean, he brought up an example of Otmar Safnauer when he was albeit Edward of Alpine, wasn't it? Like disagreeing with one rule when it was in McLaren's benefit, and then a year later agreeing with it because it's in Alpine's benefit. So yeah, one to keep an eye on. We'll just, as the rain starts falling again in the Silverstone paddock, we'll do a few little quality predictions. I appreciate it's going to be out of date by the time people hear this, but presumably McLaren are going to be right up there, isn't they, if we're judging off the free practice form?
I think they would expect to be not just the free practice form, but also recent qualifying sessions. You know, even if we just look like last week at Austria. I mean, Austria and Silverstone, for Lando in particular, that's two of his favourite tracks. Two tracks that he has gone very, very well on in the past. Lando will expect to be in the fight for pole, and I think anything that Lando expects, I think Oscar now expects too. Whether or not that will be the case, well, time will tell. But yeah, McLaren will definitely not just hope, but I think now that they've established themselves as, I think, the chief rivals to Red Bull at the moment, I think anything short of fighting Max for pole position would probably be viewed internally as a bit of a failure, really.
And that's an amazing surprise where they were this time last year, obviously, that big
is.
race. So yeah, we'll see. Obviously, you'll hear from us next time when the quality's over, so we'll get back to you. But in the meantime, thanks, Dan. Huge for having a little chat with us.
Pleasure.
My thanks to Dan for joining me for that, and now we'll move along to Sunday morning to recap an ever so slightly disappointing quali for the team.
To help me do that, we've got Lewis Larkham from Crash.net.
The quali's done. Lewis joining me now. Lewis, we'll get into McLaren in a bit, but overall thoughts on quali. Obviously, 2 Brits, 2 Mercedes on the front row. I don't think anyone saw that going in, did they?
No, it was a great day for British sport all round, wasn't it? A great qualifying session, really exciting. Went right down to the wire, and we didn't really know who was going to take pole right until the end. And what more can you ask for at the moment? That's exactly what we're hoping for. And in the end, George just did it.
Yeah, I mean, think about this time last year. I mean, well, maybe not this race, but how many years have we had where we know what's going to happen in quali? So yeah, like you said, it's very nice to see some different names up top there. I mean, Russell did very well. Story of quali, really. Obviously, Perez was a surprise exit in Q. I say surprise. It's not the first time it's happened, but still a surprise exit in Q1. Q2, Leclerc was out. I mean, I think he's having issues all weekend. But then Q3, when it really mattered, obviously Lando up in P3. I mean, as we were coming here, I suggested that it was maybe a little bit of a disappointment, but you seem to think that they probably got as much as they could out just behind a very quick Mercedes car.
Yeah, well, listening to Lando afterwards, as we know, he's very self-critical. He doesn't shake any blame, but he was obviously naturally a little bit disappointed to miss out on pole position. I'm sure he would have loved to do that at home, but generally he seemed fairly pleased and felt that he'd got the most out of the car. And I think I agree slightly with you with the McLaren, probably slightly disappointed based on recent races. They've been the nearest challengers to Red Bull. And I suppose Mercedes came in and shook it up a bit today, and that was the real surprise. We didn't expect Mercedes to be as competitive as they were.
Yeah, so, I mean, like you said, that's definitely been a surprise package over this weekend. I think even George and Lewis were quite surprised just how quick they've been. So yeah, Lando is 2.11 behind pole sitter Russell. In terms of the race, we'll get on to Piastri's qualifying in a minute, but in terms of the race and sort of what Lando can do, he's starting alongside Max. Max obviously had issues, a damaged floor in quali, so he's qualified a bit lower than perhaps he expected. What do you think when it comes to the race? Do you think McLaren have got a better race car than Mercedes, and it might show itself over the race distance?
Yeah, I think so. The long run pace for McLaren on Friday looked particularly strong as well, and I think this might be partly why Lando seems quite happy with being third. He didn't seem too downbeat. He said after qualifying, yeah, I can take this to George, I can take this to Lewis, so he seems pretty confident in McLaren's package, which, as we've seen over the last few races, has been arguably at times the quickest car on track. So I think he goes into the race in a really strong position. Mercedes are perhaps a little bit of the unknown there in terms of what they can do over a race distance, and with Max fourth, I just feel like you can't ever write Max off at the moment. It would not surprise me to see him right up there in the mix. But it should be brilliant. I mean, it's set up so nicely going to the race that, I mean, how nice is it that we can sort of go in and genuinely not know who's going to win this race? As you touched on earlier, it's been rare in the last sort of 12 months or so that we're going into a race and we genuinely don't know who could do it. And yeah, that's amazing. That's exactly what we want to see, a more competitive field.
How much do you think teamwork's going to play a role here? Because it's something we've spoken about a lot. It's usually the other way around. We used to talk about McLaren's teamwork against Max on his own, but now we've got a situation, Piastri's not too far behind, but Norris is sort of battling 2 Mercedes on their own. Do you think Mercedes is going to be a bit tactical, or do you think both their drivers are going to be allowed to race and go for it, and maybe that will let Lando in?
Well, Mercedes have always allowed their drivers to race freely, but I think they'll have to take the smart option here, which is to work together, and they've done that in the past as well. So that's an important point as well, that Oscar's a little bit further behind Lando, so unless he can maybe jump ahead of Max at the start and get involved, then McLaren could have 2 cars in the mix. But certainly you'd have to say the early advantage there is to Mercedes, just based on the fact that they've got 2 cars at the front, and they could split the strategies, they could do anything to try and at least get one of their cars to win the race, whoever is in the strongest position after the start and the opening few laps. Whereas, Lando might have to do it a little bit on his own, and certainly Max will, because once again, Sergio's too far back to really be a factor in the race, as we've come to see now in recent weeks. It's, as you said, it's not really a surprise anymore, is it, to see Checo going out early in qualifying? It's more just a question of how early.
Yeah, very early this time round. Yeah. Let's talk about Oscar then. Obviously in P5, 0.418 behind pole sitter Russell. Going to be starting right behind Lando, so obviously I think both McLaren drivers are hoping for not a first turn shunt. But what do we expect of Piastri? I mean, obviously he's got Verstappen alongside of him, he's got very quick drivers ahead. What would you think would probably be the expectation for Piastri going this? Do you think a podium's possible?
A podium might be a little bit of a stretch, I think, just based on how the race is set up now. Obviously, a lot depends on the start and the first few corners, the first laps, and so on, and how the order shapes up after that. But I think just based on if both Mercedes get away cleanly and have decent race pace, I think really he's going to need some fortune for him or misfortune for others to really get into the podium mix. Just based on how Lando seems to have had the edge over him in recent events, and as I said, Max and the Red Bull package is always up there. So a podium feels like a bit of a long stretch right now. Maybe sort of where he starts might be sort of consolidating that and trying to get in the mix with the front runners. Feels like the right sort of place that Piastri will probably end up in.
Yeah, obviously just missed out the podium last year. I mean, he had a great battle of Hamilton early on, but I think we can't be in Silverstone and talk about the weather. I mean, we're stood here now. There's a few patches of blue. It's Sunday morning, but I think rain is on its way. Rain has been here all weekend. If it does rain, I mean, currently the forecast looks like we're going to get a lot of rain up until the start. Maybe not so much rain during the race, and then a lot of rain after. So if there's a red flag or something like that, then the rain might be brought back into play. Do you think McLaren? Do you think McLaren don't want it to rain? Because obviously the more rain there is, probably the chances go towards Mercedes, a bit more of that unknown element. Do you think McLaren are sort of hoping for a dry session?
I think so, yeah. Based on recent races, they've been so strong, so competitive in the dry. I think the last thing they probably want is rain. And as you just touched on, I think that would benefit Mercedes. They looked particularly strong in the wet on Friday. And I think McLaren would like a dry, straightforward race where Lando can really show off the pace of the car and get in the mix with the front runners. I think rain is probably best for Mercedes, but as you said, we just don't know what we're going to get. Yesterday was absolutely awful throughout Saturday, and today, grey clouds around. It rained a little bit this morning during the F3, which caused a little bit of chaos, and it looks like there's rain on the way in the next hour or two, and we'll just have to wait and see whether it affects the race.
Yeah, and with that, I think rain is on its way, so we're going to run in and hide from that before the race. But yeah, thanks, Lewis. That's been great. We'll catch up again. Yeah, we'll catch up again in the listeners after the race.
With quali done, it was time for the race, and McLaren did themselves no favour with a poor strategy costing the team a potential 1-2. To recap the proceedings, I'm joined by the Independent's F1 correspondent, Kieran Jackson.
So Kieran joins me now. As you may be able to hear, there's a bit of background noise. The sun has set, I believe, or setting. A lot of people packing stuff away, very much the end of the day after a busy race weekend. McLaren, Kieran, not a great race, I feel. Very much a missed opportunity. We'll get your sort of... We'll dive into it a bit deeper, but obviously, what's your overall take of McLaren's British Grand Prix?
Just another missed opportunity, isn't it, Sam? I mean, yeah, pretty frustrating for McLaren. I actually spoke to Zach Brown this morning and he was really fancying his chances. They thought they had the quicker race pace than Mercedes, who were the only ones who were ahead of them. But it was frustrating, yeah, firstly with Oscar Piastri, which we'll go into, and then with Lando at the end. Like, it was kind of another case of McLaren not quite nailing the strategy. It wasn't like a massive blunder, but it wasn't quite getting it spot on, and that's sometimes what you need to win a Grand Prix.
Yeah, you're very much right. Let's go to the start then. Obviously, not a great start again from Lando, a bit of a theme we're seeing from him. I did want to ask Andrea Stella about it, but didn't quite get time. But definitely a theme evolving of Lando the starts. He loses P3 to Max, but meanwhile the Mercs are just absolutely flying. George and Lewis so far ahead, looking like they're going to win by a comfortable distance, but as we said before quali, it's Silverstone, rain's never too far away. I mean, that was always going to happen. I think every team, every driver was waiting to see when it arrived. Finally arrived in lap 16, and then suddenly the McLarens became like an absolute rocket ship, didn't they? So Norris overtook Verstappen, he got up to the Mercedes drivers, but also Piastri was flying. So we get into this situation where Piastri's within half a second of Norris, and then the rain increases and McLaren, like you said, have got a real choice, and this is where it all went wrong, didn't it? Like they choose not to double stack, and ultimately that was a massive
mistake. I mean, we can look back and say it's a mistake now because Piastri stays out, and then by the time he pits, Norris is in 5 seconds behind, and the whole field's very much backs onto Piastri. Piastri down to P6, I think it was, just ahead of Hulkenberg. So do you think that moment was crucial for, I mean, Piastri in particular, his race was just pretty much ruined from that point on?
When's he going to catch a break, isn't he? After the track limits last week, I really do feel for Oscar Piastri. It seems that nothing quite goes his way perfectly. I mean, he's chasing a first Grand Prix victory, much like Lando has been the last few years, and you kind of feel it just needs to nail one race perfectly, and it will happen because the pace is there for sure. I mean, he was ahead, he was deservedly ahead, and I mean, it was incredible really the way the pack caught up with him with the one lap he stayed out. I mean, you could barely keep the car on the road, and yeah, dropping to 6. I mean, I think he finished like around 12 to 15 seconds behind the winner, so that showed that pit stop was ultimately fatal. But a tough one for him to swallow. But speaking to him in the pen afterwards, well, you did at least. He's a pretty positive guy. He doesn't get down on things for too long. Doesn't get too despondent, unlike his teammate. So he'll be back.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out that gap. I think obviously when they all pitted, Lando and Oscar were quite a lot way ahead. And if you think a pit stop here takes about 25, 30 seconds. So the fact that Norris was able to do that and then come back within 5 seconds before Oscar pitted very much shows how much time was lost. And you're right, Oscar in his typical way. I mean, if we say that Lando is very self-critical, Oscar's pretty much the coolest cucumber going. He's not fussed by anything. I think this was a perfect chance for him to blame the team because it wasn't his fault, was it? It was, I mean, if we imagine someone like Verstappen in this situation, you can sort of see that he's going to not blame the team maybe 100%, but sort of very much in highlight it wasn't his fault. Whereas Oscar, I've got some of his quotes, so he was sort of asked whose choice it was to keep the team out, keep him out there behind Norris, and he said it was a joint one, so obviously immediately not putting the blame on McLaren. He said, and he even described it as the hardest call you're ever going to make in motor racing, and it's fair enough that he had two cars separated by half a second, rain's coming down, and he sort of very much saw the I don't know what you call the word, but he saw a way of not blaming the team, and like you said, like it's just very much about his character, isn't it? And
it's a collective responsibility, isn't it? Like he very much realises he's in the long game at McLaren. Doesn't do him any use to actually pinpoint one person or one person who made the decision. And he's a very mature guy, and he realises the bigger picture for sure.
Yeah, and only in his second season. It was amazing that he's already at this stage. Obviously, his race was sort of ruined at that point. I mean, he finished P4, which was, again, great result for him, but same place he finished last year, probably similar amounts of disappointment this time round. We went to Lando then because he had a bit more of an interesting end to the race. So he got the right pit, he pitted at the time, he came out still, I don't think he was in the lead, but he was still right up there. And then we get into this situation where he was in the lead. Okay, you get into a situation where you've got Lewis out ahead, or Lewis who's going to pit before Lando the second round of stops. He goes onto the softs, and Max behind goes onto the hards. And you're thinking at this moment, McLaren have got a real advantage because they're the only team that had a medium tyre left. And if we go back to Oscar quickly, he on the radio said that medium tyre is absolutely the one. And we saw that a little bit in the end when Oscar was making up some ground, not enough to challenge the podiums, but definitely enough to sort of show that that was the right tyre. Lando goes onto the softs and he gets caught by Max. He doesn't catch Lewis, so he loses out on P2 as well as the win. I mean, like you said, this is another example of McLaren and Norris in particular maybe not quite nailing those very tight margins, not getting the right tyre. And we've seen it so many times. We've seen it Sochi, things like that. They sort of come back to your memory. Like, what did you make of that moment, sort of how important that was to Norris's race and where he finished up?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was just like a catalogue of errors with that pit stop. It should have been a lap earlier. It should have been a different compound. And then Norris overshot his pit box. So, I mean, that probably resulted in the 4.5 seconds not being 3 seconds. Then he would have been closer to Hamilton when he came out. So, yeah, it was a bit of a screw up from driver and team. I mean, it was interesting for me, like in the past few weeks when Norris has just missed out on race victories, I've seen an angry Norris. I've seen, we can do better, like self-critical, but like onwards and upwards. Today, he was just absolutely despondent. I thought, like his interview with Jenson Button afterwards, he was really clear that he just can't keep doing this, can't keep letting these chances go away. And in the post-race press conference, at one point he was like literally on his haunches, like head in hands. When everyone was, inevitably asking Lewis Hamilton all the questions because he was the winner. So they need to kind of nail this because they've now got themselves to being a challenger. But the next step is to really make sure everything works in the process in tandem with driver and team and strategy. And they're not quite getting it at the moment. But no doubt it will come with time, and you learn from your mistakes, right, more than anything else. So hopeful for Hungary in a few weeks. But yeah, I mean, if you look at it the last month, Lando could be on 3 or 4 wins. And he's still on 1. So yeah, opportunity missing, finish behind Verstappen. So absolute killer is that he's further behind in the championship.
Yeah, he's lost more points. I mean, you're right. That's really a theme that Lando, in particular, sort of brought up. I mean, we were lucky enough to both be in Monaco, and I think he said it there that the team aren't quite there in terms of the very, very top level. And it's fair enough. Like the last time they were fighting for titles was probably when Lewis was in the McLaren car, which is a long time ago. I mean, pretty much the whole regime's changed since then. There's not going to be very many similar faces in that situation. And yeah, you're right. They're just making those very fine, small decisions, doing wrong. And I think Stella brought it up exactly. He said he's competing against like constructors who have been there and done that. So obviously Red Bull have won all these races the last few years. Silverstone, Mercedes have won all these races, all these championships the last 9-10 years. I appreciate them won a while. So it's very much those fine margins. And again, like I think it says a lot about Stella's character that he was very much. He took it on the team. He took it on his shoulders for the team's errors, maybe more than he could do, because obviously he'll have a say in strategy, but he's not going to have the ultimate decision. That might be someone else who's more expert. So yeah, I think it's a very mature response from Stella. He could have easily said, "This wasn't on. We need to do better," but he was very, very much reflective, and I think that shows a lot about his character.
Yeah, he's very impressive in that sense, isn't he? Like very level-headed, very, again, aware of the bigger picture, like a proper leader. I mean, very different to some of the team principals on the grid. Like, and yeah, I mean, as McLaren have become more of a competitor, you see Stella naturally on the airwaves a bit more. And yeah, very intelligent guy. You can tell how smart he is with both his wider thinking about the future and the team, but then also on the precise strategy. He's very on it, and even last week he's not afraid to be really critical of another team or another driver when he really thinks there was something that went against them which wasn't fair. So yeah, like very impressive leadership, and it almost makes it more frustrating that they can't quite get there at the minute. But you know, you live in hope that they will do it sometime soon. 2 races until the summer break.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Just to find a point on Stella, he did bring that up. He said, well, at least we're in these positions. At least we're fighting for these races now, and it's just funny from this time last year because obviously it was sort of their big arrival back into the grid, and sort of it shows how far they've come. A little bit of a short of a race review today, but we'll just end with the standings, because if you look at sort of just on a numbers base, it hasn't been that bad for the team. So 27 points overall for them. Lando obviously getting 15, Oscar 12. Lando stays in P2 because obviously Charles Leclerc had a nightmare, scored no points himself. But Oscar, I think this is really interesting. He's moved above Sergio Perez, which is mad to think where we were at the start of the year, with Perez finishing second a number of times. But Oscar to P5, I think that's very much deserved. Like you said, his luck just hasn't gone his way. McLaren now 7 points behind Ferrari, and I think the final question I asked you, Kieran, is sort of, are McLaren more in a constructors' fight than they're in a drivers' fight? They've got 2 drivers that score a lot of points very consistently, which Red Bull don't, Mercedes do, but quite far back, and Ferrari are all over the shop, really.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I think so, probably. Like, I'm just looking at the constructors' table now myself, and now they're less than 100 points behind Red Bull. My maths isn't quick enough. 78 points behind Red Bull.
There we go.
So we're halfway through the season, bang on, and 12 races to go. That feels like more than enough points to try and make up, particularly given how bad Perez is performing. Like, you look at Norris and Piastri, they're at least always in the top 10 shootout on qualifying. You know, that should always be a minimum for the top teams, but Perez actually can't do it at the moment, like for whatever reason that may be. So there's definitely an opportunity there, constructors-wise, particularly if like it's twofold, right? It depends on how Perez performs, whether he can be a consistent performer at the top again, and it depends if they can convert some of these near misses to wins from a McLaren point of view. So I think that's exciting. I think Lando, yeah, losing ground on Max is irritating today because it was a real opportunity. But again, like, you kind of just want the conversation to be as open for as long as possible. And if the next 2 races in Hungary and Belgium go well, then you know you've got 10 races after the summer break where it's a reset, and McLaren could find another 10th to get closer to Red Bull, go ahead of Red Bull. So I don't know. I like to keep it optimistic, but obviously like, Max is a huge favourite. It was a weird race, really, wasn't it? Mercedes had the pace in the first third, then it was McLaren, and then out of nowhere, Max on the hard tyre just comes through and was very close to catching Hamilton at the end. So when it looked like he didn't have any pace at all. So that's credit to him as a driver. So for sure the obvious favourite, and he might go into the distance in the next few races, but hopefully not. And I feel like whilst it's 2 figures, let's say the 100-point mark is where the limit is. Whilst it's still two figures, we can have some hope that Lando can catch it.
Yeah, that's perfect place to sum up. Yeah, thanks, Kieran, for joining me today. Obviously, a bit of a disappointment for McLaren, but obviously still a lot of positives. But yeah, that sums it up from the Silverstone paddock.
We hope you enjoy this different look at a race weekend, and my thanks go to Dan, Lewis and Kieran for joining me. There's plenty more content to come from the Silverstone weekend, so make sure you're subscribed, and why not tell a friend about the show to help it grow. But in the meantime, thanks for listening.